Everybody, and welcome back. Now today we are talking about the effects of war, political short-term impacts. So we've spent the past couple of videos discussing just how the war has impacted the world. Now we're going to dig a little deeper into specifically the political impacts it had after the war. Now, political. This is referring to a government or public affairs of a country. So everything we're going to be going over today is the after effects that shattered, in most cases, governments or enabled other governments to grow larger and more powerful as an effect of it. The first one we're going to go over is Germany. The political short-term impacts for Germany is massive. The biggest thing is the king of Germany abdicated from the throne. Abdication means he fled the country, he left. And the empire, the monarchy, completely fell in Germany. And so because of that, the German government is essentially destroyed. It's gone. There's nothing there. So they have to then deal with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles while creating a new government. The government they end up creating is the Weimar Republic. Now the Weimar Republic is inheriting the debt, inheriting the political guilt, inheriting a lot of issues that are going on in terms of like economics, but one of the biggest things that the Weimar Republic is inheriting is that their people are betrayed and heartbroken. Because leading to the war, the German Empire and the king did not tell the citizens just how the war was going. Rather, they only told their peoples their victories. They only told their people their victories or great stories that were occurring during this time. And so because of this, it came as a shock that the war was over and that Germany lost to the everyday citizens, to the everyday people. And so the only feelings that were left was absolute betrayal of the people of Germany from being lied to about how successful or not successful the war was going, but also by their own government for refusing to tell them the truth. And were suffering from massive heartache because on top of being betrayed by their own government, every other government is trying to essentially ensure that they become some of the most broken people in Europe. Thus, politically, the Weimar Republic is dealing with severe issues. And because of that, from the beginning, the people did not trust it. The people were not fans of it. They had to really struggle to accept what this new government wanted. And so because of this, Germany, or the German people, had massive social and demographic issues that resulted in new extremist groups coming out, several minor revolutions or an attempt to overthrow the government. The government was always ineffectual because as it tried to pass and do more things, it either didn't have the support from its own party or did not have support from the people. So politically, the government that exists in Germany between World War I and World War II, the Weimar Republic, is a fractured and broken government trying its hardest to fix and put the country back together in the face of every other country trying to keep them broken, specifically France, and their own people not trusting them that they had the best intentions for Germany. So because of that, the Weimar Republic is going to struggle quite a bit politically. Now, the other people we're going to look at is the Austro-Hungarians. Now, the Austro-Hungarians had a huge issue. The first being that over half of their population no longer existed within their country. The Austrian state specifically, before the war was broken, already split in two, already went through a small revolution, small breakup of their empire. So even though the Austrians were the leading family of the Austro-Hungarians, their country became minuscule. It was a tiny part of what was all of Yugoslavia, half of Bulgaria, some of Romania, and Hungary. So they were suffering from massive losses by losing say 75% of the country they used to have, losing a bunch of access to markets, factories, resources, workers. They were now severely hindered, severely hurt, and territorially broken. That is only exasperated by the inherited debt that the new government takes on. And so because of that, the new government of Austria cannot keep up. It cannot exist. It is constantly struggling to just exist as a nation, constantly struggling to grow, constantly really fighting to survive, much like the Weimar Republic. The issue being, though, is that the Weimar Republic has politically motivated citizens, whereas Austria is missing over half of the citizens that identify as Austrian. They don't have the space, they don't have the land, they don't have any of the resources that are required for this. And because of that, the Austrian government is essentially facing a complete and utter broken internal system with little to no support, because every other neighbor around Austria are competing to gain resources, or competing to grow, or competing to try to do anything that they can to survive. Because just as Austria is significantly less, so is Hungary. Serbia turns into Yugoslavia, into this much larger, massive nation. Czechoslovakia is a new country that gets created. Poland is a new country that gets created. And so now, while Austria is trying to survive, it is not getting any support from any other country, because they are all competing for themselves. They're all competing for their own survival. And that's really what the end of the war meant politically for these countries, for these two, Germany and Austria. It's this constant competition of surviving while most of these other nations are trying to keep you down. And because of this, because of how fractured Europe is overall, there's a push to have a new system, or a push to have all of these countries come together to stop competing and to work together to maintain security, peace, food, and solve the issues that came out of World War I. This came from Wilson's 14 points, but more accurately, we know it as the League of Nations. So Europe creates the League of Nations, a group of prominent European nations that come together as a managing, leading force to ensure that everyone gets along, essentially. And these League of Nations are specifically targeting what they deem to be European political powered countries. So most nations, apart from the United States, most nations in Europe either had a voice or was being controlled by, and nations elsewhere had to bend to the League of Nations. They had to agree to whatever the League of Nations wanted to. And all of this, all of what the League of Nations does, is what they say, which is to establish collective security, to have the entire nations come together to prevent anything like World War I from ever happening again. And so because of that, there's this carefully structured political alliances that shift constantly on preventing countries from going to war. This is ultimately a failure because the people in charge of the collective security, the League of Nations, have their own agendas. They have their own wants and needs and hatred that still exists and still prevalent after the war. And so, in spite of their push for rebuilding all of Europe, all of it is done with the same visceral anger, the same revenge, the same want to keep Germany, Austria, and any competing nation down. Now, that's what it is for Europe. Whereas for Japan, things are a little different. Asia, we see two major political impacts that end up occurring. The first being is that Japan starts to really get upset that although they were considered a part of Europe and were a part of the League of Nations, that anytime Japan tried to expand their control over another nation, or anytime Japan tried to grow and build their strength as the Asian leader of Asia, the League of Nations always tried to stop them, always tried to prevent them. And so because of this, leading up to the 1920s, leading up to the 1930s, Japan starts becoming a bigger and larger threat in Asia because they are now no longer wanting to listen to the League of Nations, and they are pushing to rebuild their country, rebuild their military, rebuild everything for their global campaigns. Now in China, we see something very different. China was not regarded as a European nation, even though China did fight in the war. So the Chinese government ends up being overthrown by two different political groups in China, and they're known as the GMD and the Communist Party of China. These two groups come together to overthrow their government, and after they successfully do so, they devolve into a civil war. So immediately after World War I, China starts alternating between civil wars and coming together to fight a common cause, to then going back to a civil war. So politically, we see in Asia, one country, Japan, is trying to grow as much power as they can politically in the world, as well as in their own nation, whereas China is devolving away from politics by overthrowing their government and having competing nations that are competing peoples within China. Thus, the political short term in Asia is very different from what we see in Europe.